Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 14th Annual Voices of Youth Summit. This summit is organized by high school students from all over Saskatoon. My name is Amer, and my partner's name is Thomas, and we will be your hosts this morning. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather is treaty territory, a traditional meeting grounds and gathering places of the Assiniboine, Cree, Dene, Dakota, and Saulteaux, and Métis. Sorry. We acknowledge all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries.
So good afternoon once again. Our panelists, it is a pleasure to have you here. And firstly, we'd like to thank you all for contributing and participating in our roundtable discussion. I hope we can get something meaningful out of this discussion. To start off, I'm curious about how your organization is involved in the realm of mental health, especially for high school students. So what type of service does your organization provide, direct or indirect? I would like to first pose this question to Superintendent Sather.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Sorry for the technical difficulties. That is kind of my life when it comes to Zoom. I think that specific to the organization that I am representing, which is jack.org, I think we're kind of in a really great spot because that we are by the youth for the youth, right? So with that being said, all of the programming that we have and the programs that we develop or kind of the creation of all of them has been led by youth all across the country. So therefore we have a lot of different voices, right? So specifically, I think you had mentioned, hopefully I heard it right, kind of in my tech glitches here, but I think you had mentioned as well high school students. So we have several different opportunities for high school students to get involved or for our kind of team to come to the high school. So there's different opportunities for, public speaking, for digital resources and things like that. So I think that's really unique to our organization, again, because it is so youth focused. And as well as that, we don't put barriers on people. So what I mean is regardless of your race, your sexuality, where you are, you can be involved in the organization, which I think is really important. And especially when we want to talk about youth mental health and youth engagement, we need that inclusivity, right? So with that being said, I also just think that the success of the organization is kind of shown just because our network is growing so much. And not only that, but I think the most important part of the organization is just the youth themselves, and the organization kind of plays a role in bringing people together. But more than anything, it's the work of every individual who come together and make it something really special. So I think that kind of regardless of who or what or who is involved in kind of whatever capacity that they're involved in, I think that everybody plays a pretty important role. And we have students from their later years all the way up to young adults. So with the variety of experience and the diversity that we prioritize, I think that that's also really useful as well. And more than anything, everybody who's involved has the overarching sort of mission and passion for youth mental health and creating positive change. So that also definitely really helps regardless of the capacity or level that people are involved or where they're involved. That really helps to kind of connect people. So I hope that answered your question, and I'm excited to hear from the others.
Thank you for answering the question. I just had a follow-up question for you. Do you think the pandemic has, in a way, has affected, reduced the effectiveness of your service in a way?
I definitely think it's challenging because while the pandemic has, of course, limited what we can do in person and really kind of halted that process, I think that because in a digital space, we have a lot more opportunities to connect and to come together, and maybe people that I wouldn't come across normally. I think that it's maybe even been more effective in some ways in the sense that we get to build a stronger network, we get connections and voices from more people that we maybe wouldn't necessarily know of until COVID and virtual spaces, right? So I wouldn't say that it's become less effective. I think it definitely depends on sort of the person and their expectations, of course, as well. But ultimately, I think that in a lot of ways, it's actually become more effective and more approachable as far as the programming and the involvement goes as well.
Thank you for answering the question. I would like to ask the same question to Zachary.
Sure. First of all, thank you guys for inviting me. I was going to miss youth conference this year, and so it's nice to be part of it, kind of from a different angle. Also, nice to see Emily again. It's been a minute. We used to work together, and she's a great person, and I'm excited to sit on a panel with her. And Jack.org is a great organization. They do some amazing work Canada-wide for sure, and I've been following them for a while. So to answer your question, and it's a good one. First of all, I work for CFS Saskatoon. So we're a local mental health clinic that's based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And so our reach is more focused specifically to Saskatoon area. In terms of opportunities or resources or programs for youth that we have, the team that I work with specifically focuses on school-aged youth. So we go into schools in Saskatoon and we run different mental health programs. We have anxiety programs. We have programs for violence and trauma survivors, general mental health and wellness programs. We also run programs for youth that are under high school age, so elementary aged students and youth as well. Of those programs specifically focus on emotional regulation and anxiety as well. Those are kind of things that we see a lot of. We also work with parents, which is I think a little unique, is we have programs. When we run programs for youth, we also run them the same type of program simultaneously for parents as well, so that we try to create a more holistic kind of take on mental health. It's not just individualized to one person in the family, but we look at the whole family system. So there's lots of different opportunities and lots of programs. We try to get into as many high schools in Saskatoon and as possible. The pandemic has created a bit of a unique challenge there, as some schools are more open to having guests come in and run programs than others are. But ultimately, like Emily said, it's just a different challenge, right? And different challenges cause us to come up with creative solutions. And so that's something that we've been working on for the past few months as well.
Thank you for answering the question. I love how your organization also includes the family for an individual's mental health, because I think they play an important role. So I want to let you know that your services are valued and appreciated in the community. And now I would like to pass it.
Hello, everyone. That was great. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? That was a great question, Leah. So my question is as follows. More than 30% of youth feel shy and not comfortable telling the truth to their counselors and job workers. Some of them feel that their problems are very complicated to be told to another person. Me personally, I don't feel comfortable telling the complete truth, because I feel that simply people think people don't understand me. In your opinion, how can someone supporting a young person be able to tell how honest is a person being with them and about what their experience? I would like to forward this question to our panelist, Zach.
It's a really good question. And I don't think it's just a youth problem, right? I think a lot of people have reservations about coming into any sort of therapeutic session and kind of being vulnerable. In fact, it's one of the things that I think our society struggles with as a whole, is just this whole idea of vulnerability. So first of all, let me just affirm that you're not alone in this. And if you're a youth that's watching this feeling like, man, I don't know how to talk to people about the things that I'm feeling inside, that is totally normal. So don't think that you're on the fringe or at all. I would say that one of the ways that we can do our best to try to mitigate that a little bit is through what we call the therapeutic alliance. And so what that means is that when you come into a session with the mental health worker or the counselor, the psychologist or psychiatrist, it is on them to establish that you are in a safe space, right? And that safe space is very integral to the whole counseling process. If you come in and you don't feel safe, then obviously you're not going to share things that will make you feel vulnerable. So that's one of the things that mental health professionals have to do, is create these safe spaces. And then as a youth, when you don't feel safe to share, you have the opportunity to voice that and say, look, I'm not comfortable sharing this right now. And that gives the counselor, the mental health person, the opportunity to try to work with you and see, how can we establish this safe space? And if we can't, then what are our next steps? Because I think you're totally right in that it's really difficult to just walk in and start unloading some of the things that you're feeling without having, a pre-existing relationship with the person. So you work with the counselor. It's their job to work with you to create that safe zone, and then you go from there.
So many people are unaware about what to do in a mental health emergency situations. I did not know what to do either before taking the mental health first aid training, and it's super expensive. So what steps does your organization take if you feel that other person may harm themselves or others? Like, do you have any protocols for such a situation? I would like to ask this question to Emily Sather, since Zach kind of already answered it.
For sure, thank you. And just kind of before I hop in, I just want to acknowledge Zach's message prior. It is really nice to see you as well. And to kind of speak to CFS, I'm a huge fan of the work that they do, especially as a social work student. I think that the work that CFS does is incredible. So as you said, it is an honor to kind of sit alongside you. With that being said, to answer your question, so the organization that I'm a part of, jack.org, doesn't actually offer emergency support. However, what we do offer, what I mean is like specifically for immediate help or crisis intervention, but we do offer several resources that people could connect with if they appear like they're struggling, or if they, if they decide that they need that help and they want to reach out. So we have really strong connections with Kids Help Phone, which is all across the country, and it's free to access, and you can access online, on the phone and things like that. So that's a really good option. And we also have connections to various different resources in local communities, which I can send in the chat. On our website, we have a list of resources there. And we also have a newer resource called Be There, which, like I said, is kind of fairly new, but Be There shows you various steps on how you can be a supportive friend or peer when you notice someone is struggling. And so how you can kind of have conversations with them in ways that are gentle and effective. So like I said, I'll toss some of the resources in the chat here, but I encourage you all to take a moment to just sort of look through those, and not only just to see what's online, but to kind of look around and see what's in your community too. I know oftentimes I kind of have a leeway because of my schoolwork, but I take the time to research resources in the community. So if I know of someone who's maybe struggling with some family issues, right, I'll kind of look up and see, okay, well, here's some resources that they can access, depending on, what's their budget and things like that will kind of depend on the situation, but kind of having that knowledge of what's available is super helpful for not only you, but people you may come across who may need that support. Thinking back to that, specific to the organization that I'm with, we have the Be There program, as I mentioned. So it's a fantastic resource that not only helps you recognize the signs of when someone might be struggling, but also the ways that you can kind of break the ice, start a conversation, build that trust, which we mentioned in the last question is such an important piece of story sharing and being vulnerable and opening up to people. How we can listen with them and provide support. So part of that process is not only listening, but also speaking and sharing your story too, in an appropriate and respectful way, right? So not dominating the conversation, but saying, you know what, hey, I've been through that too, and that can be really helpful and comforting for some people. As well, Be There helps us to kind of know how to set boundaries and how you can protect your mental health in that process. So I kind of can't really say enough good things about it. I highly recommend it. Yeah, I'll leave that at there for now.
Thank you for answering this the question. Now I would like to pass it on to Rama to ask the next question.
So my next question is, now we know that the youth suicide is common, especially in Saskatchewan, as there is 24% between the age of 15 to 24 in danger of the suicidal thoughts, as they face many identity and social crises. There are many ways that we could reduce these cases. One option is to create a mental health support group.
Okay, thank you for another great question. And I think that this is a topic I feel particularly passionate about, and is, like you said, the statistics show, and not only that, but our lived experience in our day-to-day lives show us how big of an issue that this is, not only in the community, but across the country, especially when we look at communities like Indigenous folks, for example, who are affected so heavily by, the lack of healthcare that they're, able to access and things like that. So that's something to be really mindful of. And I think that barriers in the city, not necessarily specific to jack.org, but just sort of the mental health landscape in general, is of course a lack of resource, but also lack of culturally competent and culturally diverse programming and care. So this could look like lack of multilingual programming, or lack of programs created and led by maybe people of color or people who are representative of populations that aren't sort of that aren't white, right? Because so often the programs are kind of led and created that way, and that's just not inclusive, and that's not the best fit for everybody, right? So I understand that could be a really large barrier as well. There's a lack of political support from a lot of different areas, right? So maybe a local government official doesn't support this, or we have federal policies and procedures that are kind of creating barriers to these mental health platforms and communications, right? So to speak to that a bit more, though, I do believe that within Saskatoon, there are several operations and organizations that do prioritize mental health. However, there are significant barriers that they face, and that's not their fault, right? It's just the system is so flawed and needs so much of that positive change, but it's kind of difficult of where to start. So as well, stigma is a huge barrier, and that looks like so many different things and so many different capacities. So as well, I think that kind of with that, and thinking specifically to youth mental health, so often they are left out of the conversation that affects them the most, right? So I think questioning why that is and having those difficult conversations is also really important to kind of help break down those barriers as well. And advocacy is something that's really important as well. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm gonna state the same question for Zach. Do you think, like, what are some of the ways that you're encouraging people?
Yeah, so first of all, back to your original question, the suicide rate for youth in Saskatchewan is very high. 24% is an astronomical number, and we need to take that very seriously. But one of the things, and this is, I think, something that's kind of a paradigm shift that's happening in the mental health world, is we need to start looking at some of these things not as the problems, but as symptoms of greater problems, if that makes sense. So when we talk about things like the social determinants of health, for example, and apply that to suicidality, we look at suicide as not the problem, but as a symptom of the bigger problem. So what are the underlying factors that influences the high suicide rates of youth in Saskatchewan? Well, one of the biggest things that we could see is poverty, right? When you look at correlations, there is a huge correlation between suicidality and poverty, and Saskatchewan has the highest number, at least it did a couple of years ago. I haven't checked the recent statistics, but a couple of years ago, we had the highest number of youth in poverty in all of Canada. We also had the lowest number of youth graduating high school in all of Canada. Well, guess what happens if you don't graduate high school? Your risk of poverty increases like tenfold. And so these are factors that I don't know if they're part of the conversation yet on the bigger level as much as they should be, right? So when we're trying to address suicidality, we need to address poverty, right? When we're trying to address poverty, we need to look at cultural and racial biases and things like that that permeate just into our societal underpinnings without, things that we don't even necessarily acknowledge. We also need to look at other social determinants of health, like, for example, belonging to a non-cisgender, or claiming, any type of LGBTQ2 plus orientation, right? These are factors that are related to suicidality, but again, we don't talk about them enough. Does that mean that we need more awareness programs? Does that mean that we just need to be more intentional about advocacy? Does that mean that we need more support networks for people who exist outside of whatever the social norm is, right? I think for sure we need to have advocacy groups or just support groups in general, for those who are at risk of suicidality. But I think, like I said, I think we need to start looking at the bigger picture as well. We know in cities that have lower populations or lower numbers of poverty, or especially of youth in poverty, then we need to be, or we see that those are, the suicide numbers in those communities tend to be a lot lower as well. We know that there's a socioeconomic correlation with suicidality. So I think, in general, I think, we can do our best on the individual level to work with youth who are experiencing, self-harming or suicidal thoughts, and that's really important. And there are a lot of organizations in Saskatoon who do that, including CFS. But at that same time, like I said, I just think the conversation needs to be bigger. It can't just be on the symptom of the problem. We need to start addressing these social problems on a more holistic level.
Thanks, Zach. Totally true. I know that poverty is a global issue, and it's a big portion of what happens with people and their mental health. Now I'd like to let my partner Dia lead on the action plan.
Unfortunately, we won't have a lot of time to go over all of our questions, so we'll just go to the action plan. So one important aspect of this conference is our desire to be very intentional about the steps we are going to take from this meeting. Because of this, we wanted to take some time to discuss what sort of actions we could take that would improve young people's ability to access mental health services. We discussed a lot of significant issues relating to mental health and also came up with some feasible solutions in this conference. The things that stood out to me were that we discussed it like how students are reluctant to open up. We also talked about youth suicide and lack of resources and culturally diverse programs and stigma surrounding around that and lack of awareness. These all factors which restrict that organization's capability and reduce their effectiveness of the service. And we also talked about socioeconomic correlations that brought it up, like how poverty and suicide, and just looking at the bigger picture, rather than looking at symptoms, what causes those mental health problems. So you guys also came up with some awesome feasible solutions, like programs which the Catholic Family Services is already running in schools, such as anxiety programs, and you're also running programs in elementary school, which is also awesome. And also, I like how you're including parents and immigrants too. And we also talk about forming therapeutic alliances and establishing a safe space, which is so important to make the students open up and share their problems with the counselor. And also how important maintaining confidentiality is. But we also talk about how in emergency situation, the confidentiality can be broken, which is essential. And yes, that's it, becoming an ally and letting them know that you are there. So now that this conversation has provided us with some context for youth mental health in Saskatoon, what are some concrete ways we can commit to make young people feel even safer to talk about their mental health? I, as a young person, want to take this opportunity to set out my own intentions moving forward. In the future, I hope to broaden my knowledge in the realm of mental health to make sure not to generalize mental health or misuse mental health terminologies and reduce the stigma and prejudices around them. So we also conducted a student survey about what the students want. Uh, so what the students want is like more frequent check-ins, empathetic counselors, and just letting them know that you are there, and also informative sessions in schools to spread awareness about mental health. Now, I would like to put forward this question to our panelists. What steps do you think we can take to make students feel comfortable talking about mental health? I would like to ask this question to Emily Sather first.
I think that relationships are so important, and they're a foundation for pretty much everything we do and have in our lives. And so I think that by sort of intentionally sort of taking the time to not only connect with people for sort of that mutually beneficial and therapeutic relationship, but also to come together to work towards advocating for mental health. So I can see that everybody here is very passionate about it. And so when we kind of connect with those that are in our circles and we all sort of have that collective voice, societally speaking, the more sort of sounds that we make, the more likely that it is to be heard, right? So I think as a concrete step, if we can come together to advocate and use our allyship and put it to good use. So whether that's, advocating online or writing a letter to policymakers, talking to your teachers or principals or superintendents at school and saying, hey, you know what, we do have some services here, like we have a counselor, for example, but it's not quite meeting our students' needs. What can we do? And also acknowledging that that's a really tough conversation to have, especially when we consider the power dynamic of being a younger person and talking to an older person. That could be really challenging and quite frightening. And I'm only 21, but even talking to someone who's 25 can be pretty frightening for me too, right? So kind of acknowledging that that can be challenging, but recognizing that there are so many people who do support you, especially on this journey, is really essential. And I think sort of some inspiration to kind of take this charge and this motivation that we have and put it to use, right? And I think another thing as well is specifically with jack.org, if you want to get loud about mental health, contact us, right? Send us an email and say, I want this to be in part of our schools, or I would love to get some training so I can, share my story, right? And things like that, I think are also concrete steps that people can take as well. And, the list goes on. And before I pass the mic over, I just want to apologize for any sort of tech glitches that I've had and any sort of miscommunications that there's been. But I think more than anything, using the energy that we have and translating it into ways that are meaningful for us. So kind of like I mentioned, whether that's coming together with our friends, writing to policymakers, when it's safe, like go to City Hall and say, hey, can I speak to somebody, or send an email, talk to your teachers, talk to your friends and family. And I think the biggest first step is creating that space and that safe space for conversation. The list goes on, but I think those are kind of my initial thoughts on this topic.
I completely agree with you. Like the first step to spreading awareness about the first step is to spread awareness about mental health and reducing the stigma around us. Also taking personal initiatives and knowing the resources that are around us. So I think it all depends upon individual motivation too. I would also like to ask this question to Zach, like what steps do you think we can take to make students feel comfortable about talking about mental health?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I love what you said about what your personal steps are going to be going forward. I think that's a really great example of probably how we all should internalize this conversation and help it to cause us to actually do something instead of just keep having the same conversations year after year after year. But with that being said, I think we need to acknowledge how new this conversation in the public sphere actually is. Okay. So for example, I'm a little bit older. I graduated high school 10 years ago. And I can tell you that when I went through high school, we did not talk about mental health at all. Okay. So like the only health programming that we had was in gym class, where they would take like 1 or 2 gym classes a year to talk about sex ed. And that was and then we did some like goal setting for our lives. And that was mental health programming in schools. So when you see how far things have come in the past 10 years, because now I work with some teachers and school counselors, so we can see that there is a big emphasis that's in most of our schools now on mental health, and it's been a really incredible progression over the last decade. But we're not near where we should be yet, right? And that's the part that you guys now get the torch of carrying this forward. We have, resources in schools and opportunities for youth to talk to people and mental health professionals, and that's a good thing. But the stigmas still exist, right? When I was in high school, if you talked to a psychologist and someone found out about it, that meant that you were crazy. And like, as far as we've come, the more I talk with youth in high schools, the more I realize that stigma still very much exists in there as well. And so I think that's where we got to put our effort, is into fighting stigmas. We need to encourage people, especially people in positions of influence and power, to acknowledge that getting mental health support and help is a normal, natural process that is healthy to individual function. So it's still hard for even me, as someone who works in the mental health field, to say, hey, I regularly see a counselor for my own mental health, right? That's really difficult for me to say in public. And it shouldn't be. And if it's difficult for me to say in public, and I have like education and I work in this field, can you imagine how hard it is for other people, right? Especially people that exist in the context where it's not safe to talk about that because the stigmas are so rampant. We have to do a better job of just being open with each other and allowing and creating the environment where it is safe to talk about mental health stuff and admit and be that we are seeking help, and that seeking help does not mean you're weak, because that's what we're all scared of, right? Is we don't want to be weird or crazy or weak, and we've got to change the conversation around mental health and to reframe it as it's actually a strength when you're so in tune with yourself that you know when you need help, and then it's just making sure that you have the resources and the opportunities to get it. So I think that's important going forward, is we need to find ways to do that. I think advocacy groups are a huge part of that. They have been over the past 10 years. They will be continuing to be so in the next 10 years. I think access to resources is huge. It's something we didn't get a lot of chance to talk about today, but we need better accesses to resources. That has to happen. Otherwise, mental health is just going to be a thing for privileged people, and we can't have that. Otherwise, we're not progressing as a society. We're just reinforcing what's already been established. So I think those are places to start. There's a lot of different directions and paths to go, like Emily said, but I think that's at least a couple of places where we can start.
I do agree with you. We have come a long way, and we have made incredible progress in the realm of mental health. But it's not like a one time thing. We need continual effort, and we have to continually make progress to completely get rid of the stigmas. And it's not just about spreading awareness about mental illnesses or mental health. It should also be about like how to take care of yourself, which is why we started the icebreaker about what do you do for self-care. So now I would like to pass it on to Ramat for the wrap-up.
I would like once again thanks all of our panelists Zach and Emily, and my partner facilitator Dia. We would like to thank all of our other peers who worked on this behind the scenes. Their work is invaluable. And as always, thanks to the Government of Canada and the Canada Service Corps for funding this conference. To close, I hope conversations like this still continue to happen and still continue to make the world a better place. Thank you.